It's like China is the kind of innovator now, in the way like Silicon Valley was 20 years ago, whatever. Where China really excels is in the building of the clean energy technologies.
China's the biggest investor in clean energy worldwide. They spent $625 billion on clean energy in 2024.
They're really trying to pioneer the innovation, batteries, solar, hydrogen fusion, everything else.
How does a country like China do something that requires innovation, that requires investment at such a rapid clip?
In China and globally, it is how do you integrate intermittent renewables? That's the challenge that everyone's facing. How do you build a grid that works? They want the rest of the world to be reliant on them and them to be less reliant on the rest of the world.
If the AI arms race ultimately comes down to an energy infrastructure arms race, has the US already ceded its pole position to China? Today, we're finding out. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker. The power grid of today is arguably the largest, most complex invention of modern human history. But is China redefining what the power grid of tomorrow might look like? Because that power grid in China is the largest the world has ever seen. Between 2010 and 2024, China's power production increased by more than the rest of the world combined. And last year alone, China generated more than twice as much electricity as the US. In the 2020s, China has completed more than 8,200 miles of ultra-high voltage lines, while the US has built 375. That's a 22-to-1 ratio for this decade. Now, these stats are more than just eye-popping. They illustrate a reality power pros are increasingly butting up against. China is trouncing the US on the energy buildout, and that could have lasting impacts on everything from the renewables market to who dominates AI. I wanted to understand how we got here, how the Chinese approach to energy investment differs from ours here in the States, and what this all means for the rest of the world and the way that we power it. So, I emailed the expert on China's energy industry, journalist and author of the Volt Insight newsletter, Henry Sanderson. Henry, welcome to Power Perspectives. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Of course, I'm thrilled to have you here. As I mentioned before we started this recording, I'm a big fan of your work. Lots of people on the team are a big fan of your work and your newsletter, especially. I'd love to know, before we dig into the conversation about China, how'd you get into this space? What makes it so compelling to you to cover China, to really focus on that as your beat within the energy industry?
I've just always been interested in China and lived in Hong Kong with my parents when I was younger, then studied Chinese at university. Studied in China for 1 year, then went back to live there for 7 years as a journalist. And I guess it was just a really interesting time, starting with the Olympics and ending with the rise of Xi Jinping. I saw a sort of China, I think, is very different to today, kind of much more open to foreign journalists. At the time, we used to complain it wasn't, but looking back, there are many more foreign journalists there, and the Olympics obviously was a big coming out party. But so yeah, it's always been a part of my sort of academic and professional interest, and it collides with what's going on with the energy transition, which is I'm also really interested in, as you outlined in the intro.
Yeah, I mean, this Venn diagram between the way that China is approaching the global economy and the energy transition feels like it is increasingly just a circle, which is why I wanted to have this conversation today. So let's dig into it. As we begin to sort of understand what the energy reality looks like in China, I want to start by sort of characterizing to the best of our abilities how their power systems in China work relative to some of the other power systems in developed nations across the rest of the world, like here in the US. Believe you're in the UK. In, a sentence or two, how would you describe what makes China's energy infrastructure so different from that in other countries?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. China obviously is a much more state controlled system, although they're trying to shift the power market more towards market forces. But it's much more controlled, a completely different system to the UK. Where I am, which is much more um, market driven. I mean, the whole of Europe now, which is sort of connected up from a power point of view, is much more market driven. But China's taking steps to make it a more market based. Where China really excels, and you mentioned in the intro, is in the building of the clean energy technologies, which I guess is more my focus than sort of the power market design, which is dominance of batteries, solar production, and China's really being responsible for lowering the cost of these clean energy technologies. And at the same time, they build up a big domestic market. So first, it was more sort of export focused, but now the domestic market leads in installations of solar, wind, and batteries. And I think the next stage in China and globally, as you kind of alluded to, is how do you integrate intermittent renewables? That's a challenge that everyone's facing. How do you build a grid that works? Because China is, probably uniquely focused on stability. Communist Party is focused on stability, so they don't like blackouts or power shortages. So that's the challenge that they face, that many other countries face.
Yeah, and that will be surely a huge part of this conversation as we talk about what makes China different. This total dominance when it comes to renewables domestically and increasingly how that factors into the international power systems that we're talking about as well. Before we get into that though, to the point about power markets shifting in China to be a little bit more market driven. A huge part of this story about China and the rest of the world is this sort of mechanics of energy investment. In China, often investment in industries like infrastructure and energy, it's all about centralized, state-directed, sort of technocratic policy that dictates certain infrastructure build out. In the US, as a comparison, some of these mega scaled projects, they depend really heavily on private investment. They're more market driven. You mentioned China's shifting a little bit more to that more market driven approach to energy investment. Can you tell me why and how?
So I think it's just a matter of improving the efficiency, and also when you have intermittent renewables, you need to have a more market-based system so that demand, supply meets demand, and it can all sort of match up. And they're talking about using AI as well. I mean, there was an interesting sort of study session I saw that the State Council held this week. And I'm just looking at my notes, but the Li Chang called for increased investment in storage facilities, new distribution systems, and charging infrastructure, plus using AI to drive grid digitalization. So that's really interesting. Shows the way that they're thinking. Using AI in very practical ways to improve the grid and try and match it all up at the same time as building out the infrastructure. So yes, they do need to move towards a more market based system. We've seen this in China and a lot of other sectors, and China actually has very active futures markets, much more active than in the West for commodities, which is an area that I look at a lot. So a lot of speculation, sort of market behavior driving a lot of these markets. But power has always been more controlled, for good reason. Because if a lot of China's industrial advantage, so China's power use is much more industry than consumer compared to Western countries, I think. So, a lot of their industrial advantage is due to power costs. So they've had to keep the power costs controlled and low. But they've also run into issues where, they've kept the coal price too low, so there hasn't been the incentive to meet the demand when the demand surges. So the market-based system really can help do that and help eliminate the risk of blackouts and other grid failures. Because when there is blackout or something like that, because China has so much industry, it could be quite damaging for manufacturing.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And this idea of industry versus consumer is something that I think is really compelling. It makes me wonder if this is the primary reason that China has really prioritized energy investment. It obviously takes a lot of money and a lot of policy to build a grid of this size, even if it is shifting more toward a market-based system. Is that prevalence of industry versus the consumer usage of power in China why the energy investment has been so large? What's kind of the context of this build out, maybe relative to some of the other major investments that China has made in its economy in recent memory?
One reason is industry needs it, and to keep maintaining the manufacturing industries to make them cost competitive, they need a lot of energy. But the other is just it plays into the strengths of China, which is building infrastructure. They love mega projects, and that goes back many decades. But we've seen Three Gorges, we've seen hydropower is relatively underappreciated, but they've built a lot of hydropower in China. And actually, the next 5-year plan, they have a huge hydropower target, 100 gigawatts, I think. So, hydropower, again, is something that really plays into their strengths, which is building massive projects. They have less concerns or worries about, communities or moving people out the way. I mean, I remember Three Gorges, there was you had to move, huge amounts of people. So it plays into what they like doing, which is, building infrastructure. And a lot of the economy has been modeled on, investment and infrastructure. And this is one of the big problems with China, right? They need to boost consumption. So it plays into all their strengths. And then you've got big players like State Grid, um, you know, obviously are state owned, as state controlled, who have big investment plans for the grid. But yes, the heart of it is they have built up a ginormous manufacturing industrial sector that needs a lot of power. And without enough power, without cheap power, they're not competitive. And we're in an era now where the West has tried to rebuild manufacturing, reshore manufacturing, everything from aluminium, steel, batteries. So they're facing more competition on that front, but they still are. Aluminium is one of the most energy intense things you can produce. Right, it's basically energy, and they produce 60% of the world's aluminium, and so they need a lot of energy. And it's interesting in industries because a lot has moved to areas with hydropower. So aluminium is one, batteries, battery materials. So that's one thing that's happened, and then also using natural gas rather than coal. So yeah, that's the way I see it. Industry is super important.
And to think too about the fundamental differences between the economy in China and that which, many of our listeners are in North America, the economies that we know and participate in every single day, how they just at a molecular level are different, right? One so focused on manufacturing, one so focused on consumer. It certainly is a good sort of tee up to understand the scale of some of these projects and that it is just built into the economy and sort of the DNA of that economy in China to pull off these massive projects. Now, one of these massive infrastructure projects is obviously renewables of many different types, sort of across the spectrum. You mentioned this earlier on in this conversation already. China's the biggest investor in clean energy worldwide. They spent $625 billion on clean energy in 2024. And again, just for comparison, because I think these stats are very interesting, the US has allocated about, at the time of this report that I'm citing here, it came out, 321 billion in clean energy projects since the IRA was passed in 2022. So we're talking about several years for the US to spend half the amount that China spent in just 2024. Now, clearly, China has really heavily invested in renewables, built this enormous fleet of renewables, even as it continues to, burn coal and figure out a space for natural gas. What does this approach mean for the energy future in China? Is it something that will be primarily driven by renewables? Is there more of that sort of gradualism bridge to get to renewables? Tell me a little bit more about how you envision that power mix of the future in China, knowing that its grid is playing such an important role in sort of the global economy.
Yeah, it's a really important question, probably the fundamental question to the planet, right? Which is decarbonization of China, because and there are many loads of experts looking at this with interesting views. But yes, if you think about they produce most of the carbon emissions, the biggest car market in the world. So it really matters to the whole planet what pathway they have. And so what we're seeing now, and I think the war in Iran only accelerates this, is we're not seeing strong language about getting rid of coal or anything like that. So they're maintaining coal, but I think the role coal, they want it to shift to be more backup or try to improve the performance of the coal-fired power plants by various means, right? Try to reduce their emissions. So we don't see coal going away, overnight, but certainly in the power sector, they've had very impressive installations of wind and solar, which which is meeting the demand growth. So coal's not going away, but they're kind of the way I look at it is that all of the above kind of energy. They're building a lot of nuclear. Um, they are hydro, as I said, a lot of hydropower, along with the wind and solar. And what's interesting also is the West, at least in Europe, everyone's very negative about hydrogen, but China put hydrogen in the sort of next 5-year plan, along with nuclear fusion, which obviously they're working on. So they're really trying everything. And what is so interesting now? So when you look at energy, it's like China is the kind of innovator now. In the way like Silicon Valley was, or 20 years ago, whatever. Chinese companies now are having these technology launches all the time, which are big televised press conferences that are like what Apple used to do, or technology companies. So they're really trying to pioneer the innovation, on batteries, solar, hydrogen, as I said, fusion, everything else, because their energy demand is massive, right? So they need to try and find ways. But that is a really interesting shift, which is instead of just like scaling up technology that the West invented, they're now really innovating in the clean energy space, and so it'd be really interesting to see um, how that develops.
And that innovation is happening very rapidly. I think it was in 2024 that China reached its target to bring 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar generating capacity online. It was 6 years ahead of schedule. Imagining something like that happening in the United States just feels so unlikely. We're constantly pushing deadlines back, totally getting rid of deadlines in the first place. There is no federal mandate of that nature. How does a country like China do something that requires innovation, that requires investment at such a rapid clip?
Yeah, so I think the sort of investment and scaling up, that's what they've been very good at, where you have a plan or a 5-year plan. The central government sort of sets the direction, and then there's the provincial governments work out their plans, and they really incentivize investment at the local level. And we've seen a huge amount of that, right? And that's what China's very, very good at, right? The kind of incentivizing investment at the local level in industrial parks, manufacturing, and the central government sets quite clear targets. And I think that's been the issue in the US with a lot of clean energy investment, which is the policy uncertainty. The changes in policy from Biden to Trump makes it very hard to allocate that kind of longer term investment. I think that's been a huge issue. So China has that sort of longer term focus. But at the same time, they have their lobbies. They have a big coal industry. It's not like those guys don't have a voice, or they don't have a input. And we have seen China be, we have the language on coal is not particularly strong at the moment. So there's they do have their own lobbies to deal with. But I think you're right. Having these targets, having this sort of direction, having this sort of provincial governments, and then the state banking system, right, where you can offer cheap credit, and they're very incentivized to lend. So all of it manages to incentivize investment, but they have a lot of problems, which is they have built so much manufacturing capacity that yes, the prices for solar and batteries have come down, but a lot of people aren't making money or profits. And there's very what they call involution, which is kind of excessive competition that kind of drives down margins and prices. Is actually a real problem, because if you also want to innovate, you need money for R&D. You need, it's good to make a profit. If you want to have a lot of innovation. Whereas in China, you often have a few companies making profit, but everyone else not making a profit. So you'll struggle to really innovate if you have that kind of situation. So that's why Beijing, I think, is really trying to tackle that fundamental issue, which is how do you create healthier, more sustainable sort of manufacturing, which will lead to innovation. So now, really, the stress is on innovation, on new products, on technologies, on customers, and also going global. So Chinese companies going and investing around the world.
to this idea of a renewed focus or investment on, innovation and those new products as you're talking about here, I can't help but wonder about the supply chain for all of this. When we're talking about some of the biggest blockers to innovation, at least in the US power system, often supply chain is at the very top along with permitting reform. China owns over 70% of global solar, wind, battery, and electric vehicle supply chains, which is a huge portion. What does the supply chain look like in China? And how do you think, especially when it comes to renewables, and how might that impact China's perception of, what we here in the United States might call energy dominance, what other people might call energy security? Tell me a little bit more about how that supply chain in China factors into the security of ensuring that this continued investment and innovation can, be perpetuated into the future.
The Iran war has only increased China's desire for energy security and reducing its reliance on global supply chains, because a lot of things have been impacted. For China, they want the rest of the world to be reliant on them and them to be less reliant on the rest of the world. So we buy their exports, but in turn they can kind of shore up their supply chain, because a lot of these supply chains are quite vulnerable to raw material inputs. So aluminium, they import bauxite from Guinea. Lithium comes from Zimbabwe and Australia and Mali and other places. So they're very vulnerable to imports and shocks, as we see with this Iran war. So energy security for them means kind of shoring up those supply chains at the same time as selling to the rest of the world. But on the flip side, it's not that healthy for the energy transition for China to be so dominant, because it creates a very risky argument in the West, right? Which is switching to clean energy only swaps a reliance on some fossil fuel producers to one on China. And in the US, I think this is really an acute problem, right? Because the US is now a big fossil fuel producer. So you're saying, do you want to switch from fossil fuels to reliance on Chinese technology, Chinese systems, and all that? So that, I think, is the problem. But I think one way China is trying to solve it is for Chinese companies to invest overseas, as I mentioned, but actually localize production. And we've seen this in Hungary and Brazil and other places. Now, the big question is whether they can do that, and also costs go up in that process. So that's going to increase the cost of clean energy products.
And let me tell you, living in the United States, going from an energy exporter to an energy importer is a tough sell. It is one of the things that we, talk about most at Energy Central and on this show specifically. To the idea of some of these Chinese companies especially really dominating parts of the renewables conversation, I think the investment in batteries, battery tech is something that we have to talk about. This is a huge story, and I wanna know a little bit more about how, the investment there factors into China's overall energy strategy, but especially within the context of the prevalence of some of the names like, these big players. And I'd love to hear who you think the big players are too in China when we're talking about battery tech that's happening on the global stage. We're talking about some of these Chinese battery companies here in the US, the ways that they operate, the ways that they innovate, all of that matters a lot to everybody across the globe. So how does the battery story really fit into China's broader energy strategy here? And how might that in turn trickle down to impact the rest of us in the West and across the rest of the world?
Yeah, this is a really great question, because batteries are really at the heart, I think, of the energy transition, because not only electric vehicles, but grid batteries. So being able to store all this wind and solar that we've been talking about on the grid, and then in the future, using your car as a battery that the grid can also access, sort of vehicle to grid technology, which is also here and being developed. So batteries really, and then you think about batteries for data centers, and then people's homes having their batteries, or companies having batteries behind the meter. So batteries are really at the core of it, and China completely dominates this industry and is much cheaper than other players outside China. So in China, batteries, lithium iron phosphate, which is the cheapest chemistry, are around $50 a kilowatt hour. So, but then production outside China would be much higher. And for a nickel-based chemistry, sort of 80, 90, $100 kilowatt hour. So it's a big difference. So that's why if you're looking at grid scale batteries, cost is super important, because either these are big container sized batteries. So cost and life cycle, safety, all that are very important. So China really dominates, mostly through the cost, but also the technology. Having good technology, innovating, increasing the performance, all the different metrics. So it's hard to see how the West can catch up. So in the US, there are the Korean battery companies, Japanese battery companies, and these are really supported under Biden through tax credits and EV consumer tax credits. But now it's a bit more challenging situation, because EV sales, I think, declined in the US, and Trump repealed that consumer EV tax credit. So you just have the battery production tax credits, but you don't have the sort of demand support. So that there is production outside China, but it faces challenges from lack of demand, or not enough demand, and then also the Chinese companies coming globally, as I said, and building factories around the world outside China. So batteries are really central. China dominates. It's really innovating to try and capture the next stage. And really, what's key is innovating so that every use case can be tackled by batteries, and you can expand the market. So you can serve everyone, from the driver who has to have 1,000 kilometers range or 800 miles, or who needs to have that. That can be served. You may have to pay for it, but that can be served, to the mass market, cheaper vehicles, to vehicles that can work in cold weather, to electric ships, aviation, etc. So trying to really widen what batteries can do, and that's what's so fascinating, is can these innovations unlock much more use cases.
A bit staggering to really come to grips with just how interconnected all of this is. Obviously, we live on a shared planet that we want to protect and we want to do our best to be good stewards of. But it really is never ceases to really kind of stop me in my tracks to think about just how interconnected our supply chains are, our power grids ultimately are as a result, and like the lives that we live are as well.
Yes.
And I think that this leads us to an interesting part of this conversation that I'm really curious to hear your perspective on, which is how all of this fits into the perceptions that we as sort of, the global economy have of the future being driven a lot by artificial intelligence. This is a big part of why we have these conversations about things like building out a ton of renewables infrastructure, building out transmission, speed to power. All of this matters so much because we're talking about getting some of these hyperscale projects online as quickly as possible to power this potential economy of the future. In China, the reserve margin has never dipped below 80 to 100% nationwide. Not the same for a lot of countries across the West and the rest of the world. Yeah, I guess in theory, I would assume that that means that they can kind of welcome that infrastructure a little bit more readily, maybe than in other developed countries. Does that put China at an advantage when we're talking about this race to own the AI future? Whether or not we think there needs to be a race is perhaps a conversation for another time. Today, there is. And I would love to hear your perspective on how China's grid investment, its, electricity availability, how all of that plays into maybe who the winners and losers might be in this perceived race.
If you see AI as a race, and to have as much energy available to power, I think China's in a really good position. As we talked about, they're very good at building power and energy infrastructure, and building these ultra high voltage lines, just building energy capacity, as you mentioned at the very beginning. And I think China's also got a strategy to move some data centers to the southwest, where they're having hydro, solar, and wind combinations. So shifting it towards those areas that have that kind of power. But I'm not. But I think from what I hear from people who look at AI much more closely, is China's more focused on AI, and some more practical applications are being used in on the factory floor, in manufacturing, or in real world applications, rather than finding the next like app that we we all going to use, right? So I think there is a difference between how they're looking at AI as a way to improve their grid, as we talked about, and manufacturing, massive manufacturing industry, and then also things like self-driving, et cetera, et cetera. So there may be a difference of focus that requires different things. But then also there's a question of AI becoming more efficient, and using less energy. I still think is not clear how that pathway is going to go. I mean, at the moment, it looks like it's a big power consumer and going to continue. But obviously, there are always efficiencies that come out that can reduce that. But yeah, from a just a sort of power and energy perspective, China would be ahead. But it's not only about that, right? It's about a whole load of other things. And it seems to me that the US is in a pretty good place when it comes to AI, with a lot of innovative capacity. I think the real question is, we've seen data centers, I think, and you probably know more, but in the US are using a lot of gas turbines, and there is a need for quick power, and batteries can help with that as well, and longer duration storage batteries. And I think that's a field which is really interesting to watch, which is the sort of longer duration batteries. And we still don't know like what chemistries are going to be the best for that, where you need a super low cost, dollar per kilowatt hour cost. So that's a really interesting field. And the US actually has, there's interesting iron air battery form energy, how to deal with the utility in the US. So there's a lot happening in that space as well. So it's no in my mind, there's no means, it probably is a race, as you say, but it's no means clear that, China's necessarily massively ahead in the AI race just because of its power and energy capacity. I think that's probably too simplified.
Is about so much more than just the amount of electricity that we have on the grid. It's also about innovation. It's also about the ways that we incentivize certain entities, whether it's the hyperscalers, the data center developers, the everyday people, how we incentivize people to use different kinds of energy, I think is also interesting. We're looking at this sudden influx in the United States of behind the meter natural gas for some of these data centers, when
Yes.
there are other options, right? There are other innovative options, and we have to determine sort of who pays the premium to make that technology more accessible and more affordable for the rest of us. Some people would say it's the big tech companies. Some people would say it's somebody else. And again, an episode for another time. I'm sure it's certainly an interesting
But I
thing.
guess one thing is I read about there's a backlash in the US against data centers, and I guess would that I guess that's something China is not going to have, right? So perhaps that's another advantage. They can build without that backlash. And I've read that communities in the US are very against these data centers coming in.
Absolutely. I mean, a tremendous backlash, and I am gonna botch the stat. Data centers are now more controversial than wind power or something in the United States. This is a huge conversation that people are having, that especially utilities are having, because often the closest tie that an everyday consumer, who your neighbor down the street, has to the power grid is that utility bill that they get each month. So when they see that going up, they immediately think it's the utilities' role, right, in how these data centers are coming online, which isn't always the case. There, again, with many of the parts of this conversation we have had today, lots of context, lots of different moving parts here that we have to take into account. As we're thinking too about this idea of the race and kind of who is ahead, and the advantages that China has, the advantages that other countries might have as well. I would love to understand, just as we finish here, a little bit of your maybe predictions, ideas, thoughts about the future in terms of, what it means to be an energy superpower. I think that's a pair of words that gets tossed around a lot, and I would love to hear what you think it means to be an energy superpower in the modern definition, and maybe who, if it's China, if it's somebody else, if it's another country, might sort of fit that bill as we move forward.
The concept of an energy superpower is changing, and I think it's an energy superpower is probably one that can provide cheap, clean energy, so that country can capture the industries of the future, such as AI, such as we're still going to need manufacturing, we're still going to need materials and minerals, um, and so China very much looks like that kind of energy and clean energy superpower where they can provide enough cheap power to capture these industries. Um, but again, China still has this heavy coal-fired power um, capacity, and that's a real question about how quickly they can kind of reduce that share, which is happening, but how quickly uh, can they do that? And probably the superpower in energy, as we've talked about, is one that can create the new grid, right? You talked about the grid being the most complex thing. That's one of the biggest challenges. And in China, would that be a national unified grid that uses AI and that works intelligently, and demand also works intelligently? So, you know, that's the world I hope we move to, where our EVs charge overnight at certain times. That's good for the grid. Maybe also our washing machines and everything else. And demand is much more integrated into the grid, and this is the same for data centers and everything else. So I think in that way AI comes together, right? So the country that kind of can use AI to build a modern grid that delivers all these things will be one that wins. But then also you want to actually produce and have a stake in these technologies, so have some sort of capacity in these technologies, and that's what China has massively developed. And the more China exports, the more it kind of ties countries into its orbit, right? If you think about many developing countries, are they building their grid on Chinese technology? China's exporting a lot of transformers, a lot of batteries, everything else. That gives China a lot of power and political power, and we've seen China use its leverage in rare earths and other things. So it's hard. It's a different system because, unlike fossil fuels, once you build the infrastructure, you're less vulnerable. But there are still vulnerabilities in these supply chains, and so that potentially could give a country uh, greater leverage. Now, there is a really interesting field and an interesting question about the energy security of more electrified systems, right? If you electrify more, you rely more on renewables. What are the vulnerabilities in those systems? And that's also a big question as well.
And one that I think we're still trying to figure out how we answer. I think this is a great way to cap off this conversation, Henry, to kind of understand what dominance looks like in the future, how that might shift and change based on where we are, both in the world and in the energy story that is still unfolding today. So thank you so much for joining us today on Power Perspectives. It has been such a pleasure to get to hear some of your wonderful insights that I have come to know and love in the newsletter, live and in person, at least virtually. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And if you want to check out Henry's newsletter, we will be sure to link that in the show notes, as well as Henry's wonderful book, too. So keep an eye out for some of those details in the description of this episode. Thank you to all of you for listening in to this episode of Power Perspectives. Once again, I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and I will see you next time.